Happy 70th birthday, Mom. Sorry we couldn't make it. My son texted me at 8:14 that night, while photos of my entire family laughing on a Caribbean cruise were already flooding Facebook. I spent 3 weeks planning my 70th birthday dinner. 3 weeks polishing silverware that had belonged to my mother, ironing linen napkins, and practicing recipes I hadn't made in years because Daniel used to love my pot roast when he was a boy. I still remembered the way he would stand beside the stove at 8 years old asking if he could steal carrots before dinner. Back then he used to say my house smelled like safety. Funny how memories can survive long after people stop meaning them. By noon that Saturday my dining room looked beautiful. The candles stood tall in crystal holders. Fresh white roses sat in the center of the table. 8 place settings. 8 handwritten name cards. Daniel, Claire, Sophie, Mason, Patricia. Even Walter Bennett, my late husband's oldest friend, had promised he might stop by after church if he finished a client meeting in time. I wore a navy blue dress I had bought 2 months earlier during a clearance sale at Macy's. Nothing extravagant, just elegant enough to make me feel less invisible. I even curled my hair the way my husband Thomas used to like before cancer hollowed him into someone painfully quiet during his final year. At 5:45 p.m., the roast came out of the oven perfectly browned. The smell filled the kitchen. Warm. Familiar. Like every family dinner I had hosted for the last 40 years. By 6 o'clock, nobody had arrived. I checked my phone twice. Then 3 times. No messages. No calls. Outside my kitchen window, the October sky slowly darkened over the neighborhood. A few leaves scraped across the driveway in the wind. I told myself traffic in Chicago was unpredictable on weekends. By 6:40, the mashed potatoes were beginning to dry around the edges. I lowered the oven temperature to keep the food warm. At 7:05 I called Daniel. Straight to voicemail. Claire's phone rang twice before disconnecting. Patricia didn't answer either, which felt strange because my younger sister usually picked up immediately, even if only to complain about her arthritis. I sat alone at the dining table staring at 8 untouched plates while the candles slowly burned lower. The silence in the house felt unnatural. Not peaceful. Hollow. Like the walls themselves knew something I didn't. At 7:52 I made the mistake that changed everything. I opened Facebook. The first photo appeared before the page had fully loaded. Claire stood on the deck of a cruise ship wearing a flowing white sundress and oversized sunglasses. Behind her stretched endless blue water sparkling beneath the sunset. Daniel stood beside her smiling wider than I had seen him smile in years. Sophie and Mason held tropical drinks with tiny paper umbrellas while Patricia leaned against the railing laughing beside them. Everyone was there. Every single person I had spent all afternoon waiting for. The caption underneath the photo read, "Much needed family getaway with the people who matter most." My hands went cold. I stared at the screen while more pictures appeared. Steak dinners. Poolside cocktails. Group selfies. Claire smiling at the center of every image like a woman posing inside a life she had carefully stolen from someone else. Then my phone buzzed. A text from Daniel. "Happy birthday, Mom. Sorry we couldn't make it. Claire surprised us with this cruise months ago." Months ago. They had planned this for months while I sat here buying flowers and folding napkins like a fool. I looked around my dining room then. The candles had almost burned out completely. The food was cold. My reflection stared back at me through the dark window over the sink. Small. Still. Unwanted. And for the first time in my 70 years, I realized something far worse than being forgotten. They hadn't forgotten me at all. They had erased me. I did not cry that night. I think that surprised me more than the cruise photos. After Thomas died 3 years earlier, I cried over everything. Grocery store songs. Empty coffee cups. His old winter coat hanging untouched in the hallway closet. Grief had turned me into someone fragile for a while. But sitting alone at that dining table with cold mashed potatoes hardening in porcelain bowls, I felt something different. Not sadness. Clarity. I cleaned the kitchen slowly after midnight. I wrapped untouched slices of roast beef in foil. I scraped uneaten food into the trash disposal. The dishwasher hummed softly while the house settled into silence around me. Every now and then my phone buzzed with cruise photos from relatives who apparently forgot I could see social media too. Claire standing beside a champagne fountain. Mason holding a plate stacked with crab legs. Sophie smiling under strings of lights on the ship deck. Daniel with his arm around his wife, looking relaxed in a way he never seemed around me anymore. I finally turned my phone face down on the counter. Around 1 in the morning, I opened the hallway closet to put away my purse and noticed something strange. My coat rack looked emptier than usual. Thomas used to joke that I owned enough winter coats for an entire church choir, but now only 3 remained. I stood there staring for several seconds before realizing Claire had borrowed 2 of my coats last winter and never returned them. Suddenly little memories began surfacing one after another like objects floating up from dark water. Last Thanksgiving, Claire changed dinner plans at the last minute and hosted at her house instead. She told me the drive would be too exhausting for me after sunset, even though her home was only 30 minutes away. 2 months later, Sophie's piano recital invitation somehow got mailed to the wrong address. Daniel apologized, but Claire never mentioned it. The year before that, I arrived at Mason's birthday party and found out everyone had already eaten because Claire told them I probably would not stay long anyway. At the time, I convinced myself families simply changed as children grew older. I blamed modern schedules, busy lives, young parents under stress. But standing in that quiet hallway after midnight, I realized something painful. None of those moments were accidents. They formed a pattern. Small exclusions, tiny humiliations, carefully measured distances, like invisible stitches slowly sealing me outside the family. The next morning, sunlight pushed through my kitchen curtains far too brightly for how little sleep I had gotten. I poured coffee into Thomas's old ceramic mug before remembering he was gone. I still did that sometimes. Muscle memory survives longer than denial. I sat at the kitchen table scrolling through years of photos online. Birthday dinners I was never invited to. Beach weekends I only learned about afterward. School plays. Barbecues. Matching Christmas pajamas. In almost every picture, Claire stood in the center smiling confidently while I appeared less and less over time until eventually I disappeared completely. Around 10 o'clock, Patricia finally called. Her voice sounded hesitant, which was unusual for her. My sister had never hesitated about anything in 70 years. "Evelyn," she said quietly, "I need to tell you something before someone else does." I held the coffee mug tighter without answering. "Claire booked that cruise 6 months ago," Patricia continued. "Your birthday was always part of the plan." The kitchen suddenly felt colder despite the sunlight. "Daniel said maybe they should postpone it," Patricia whispered. "But Claire told him if you came along, the whole trip would feel depressing." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. I stared out the window at the bird feeder Thomas built 15 years earlier. 2 cardinals landed there together while dry autumn leaves drifted across the backyard grass. Patricia sounded close to tears. "I am sorry, Evelyn. I should have told you sooner." But I barely heard her anymore because one sentence kept echoing inside my head. "If Evelyn comes, the whole trip will feel depressing. Not inconvenient. Not expensive. Depressing. As though my presence itself had become something heavy they needed to escape." After Patricia ended the call, I sat in my kitchen for almost an hour without moving. My coffee had gone cold beside me, but I kept both hands wrapped around the mug anyway because the ceramic still held a little warmth near the bottom. Outside, the neighborhood looked painfully ordinary. A teenager jogged past with headphones on. Someone across the street dragged garbage bins toward the curb. A delivery truck stopped 2 houses down. Life kept moving with the same quiet rhythm it always had, while something inside me slowly rearranged itself into a truth I could no longer avoid. Claire had not removed me from the family all at once. That would have been obvious. Too cruel. Too risky. Instead, she had done it carefully. Politely. One small exclusion at a time. I thought back to the first year Daniel brought her home. She arrived carrying homemade brownies and a bottle of red wine with a soft smile that made everyone instantly trust her. She complimented my curtains, asked for my recipes, called me Miss Evelyn, even after I told her she could simply call me Evelyn. Thomas adored her immediately. "She is polished," he whispered to me after dinner that night. "Smart. Ambitious." He was right about all 3. Claire knew exactly how to make people feel chosen. That was her gift. During their engagement, she included me in everything. Cake tastings, dress shopping, seating charts. She sent me photos asking which flowers looked more elegant for the ceremony. Back then, I truly believed I had gained a daughter. Looking back now, I think she was studying us, learning where every emotional door was hidden before quietly locking them one by one. The changes started after Thomas got sick. At first they seemed harmless. Claire began hosting more holidays herself because she said it would take pressure off me. Daniel stopped calling every Sunday and switched to brief text messages instead. Sophie and Mason became busier with school, sports, and friends. Every explanation sounded reasonable on its own. That was the genius of it. Nothing ever felt dramatic enough to confront. But the distance kept growing anyway. I remembered one Christmas Eve in particular. I spent all afternoon baking pecan pies while snow covered the neighborhood outside. Around 4 o'clock, Claire called saying the roads felt too icy for the children to drive over. Yet later that night, Sophie accidentally posted photos online showing the entire family at Claire's parents' house 40 minutes away. I never mentioned it. Another time, Daniel promised to take me to lunch for Mother's Day. 30 minutes before we were supposed to meet, Claire texted saying Mason had developed a stomachache. 2 hours later, photos appeared online from a lakeside restaurant downtown. Mason looked perfectly healthy holding a cheeseburger bigger than his face. I always found ways to excuse them because admitting the truth felt unbearable. Nobody wants to believe their own child is slowly agreeing to their disappearance. Around noon, I walked upstairs into my bedroom and opened the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. Thomas used to keep important papers there before his illness forced us to simplify things. Beneath old photo albums and folded blankets, I found a stack of birthday cards Daniel made when he was little. Crayon drawings. Misspelled words. One card from 2nd grade read, "Mom, thank you for making our house the happiest place in the world." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I looked around the room Thomas and I shared for 42 years. The pale blue wallpaper. The oak dresser. The framed family portraits lining the wall. In the oldest photos, Daniel always stood close beside me. In the newer ones, Claire stood between us almost every time. I had never noticed that before. Not until now. That afternoon, for the first time since Thomas died, I locked the front door in the middle of the day and closed every curtain in the house. Not because I was afraid, because I finally understood something chilling. I had spent years trying to hold my family together, while someone else had quietly been teaching them how to live without me. 3 days after my birthday, Daniel finally called. His name appeared on my phone while I was standing in the laundry room folding towels Thomas bought during one of our road trips to Wisconsin years ago. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen vibrating in my hand. I noticed something strange then. My heart did not race anymore. There was no relief. No excitement. Just curiosity. I answered on the 4th ring. "Hey, Mom," Daniel said casually, as though we had spoken yesterday under normal circumstances. In the background, I could hear ocean waves and distant laughter. "I tried calling earlier." That was not true. I said nothing. "Listen," he continued. "Claire thought maybe you were upset about the trip." Upset. Such a small word for something so enormous. I folded another towel carefully before responding. Was I supposed to know about it? Silence stretched briefly across the line. Then came the sigh. The tired sigh people use when they are preparing to blame someone gently while pretending not to. "Mom, we talked about this months ago." I closed my eyes slowly. There it was. The rewriting of reality. "No," I answered quietly. "You did not." Another pause. "Well," he said, lowering his voice, "Claire probably mentioned it and you forgot." Forgot. I looked around the laundry room at the shelves I organized every spring with labeled storage bins and neatly stacked linens. Since Thomas died, I balanced every bill, remembered every medication, every insurance payment, every birthday, every doctor appointment without help from anyone. Yet suddenly I was the forgetful old woman. Convenient. "I did not forget, Daniel." He exhaled heavily again. "Mom, you have been very emotional lately." Claire was trying to avoid unnecessary stress. Emotional. Stress. Every sentence felt polished in advance, as though he had rehearsed this conversation beside his wife before dialing my number. I leaned against the washing machine and stared at the floor tiles while memories flickered through my mind with painful clarity. Claire correcting me in front of the children whenever I forgot a minor detail. Claire insisting I should stop driving at night even though my eyesight remained perfectly fine. Claire speaking slowly to me during family dinners in that careful voice people reserve for elderly strangers at pharmacies. Tiny moments. Small humiliations. Never cruel enough to confront directly. Just enough to slowly reposition me from mother to burden. Daniel, I asked softly, did Claire really say I would make the trip depressing? Complete silence this time. I could hear whine through the phone speaker. Somewhere nearby a child laughed. Finally he spoke again, quieter now. Patricia should not have repeated private conversations. He did not deny it. That hurt more than the sentence itself. My son used to defend me instantly when kids teased me at church bake sales or grocery stores when I was a young widow before marrying Thomas. Once, when Daniel was 10 years old, he punched another boy for making fun of my old station wagon. He came home terrified he would disappoint me, but secretly I remember feeling touched by how fiercely he loved me. Now he could not even defend my dignity in a conversation with his own wife. I think maybe we should talk when you get home, he said carefully. Claire feels terrible. Another lie. Claire did not feel terrible. Women like Claire only regretted consequences. I folded the last towel slowly and placed it into the basket. Enjoy your vacation, Daniel, I said calmly. We will talk when you come back. Before he could answer, I ended the call. Then I stood alone in the laundry room listening to the dryer tumble softly behind me. For years, I thought Claire had stolen my place in the family. But that afternoon, for the first time, I realized something far more painful. Nobody can steal your place unless someone you love quietly hands it over. The house felt different after that phone call. Not emptier. Sharper. Like someone had finally cleaned a fogged window I had spent years staring through without realizing how little I could actually see. For the next several days, I stopped reaching out entirely. No texts to Daniel. No comments under Sophie's photos. No checking whether Claire viewed my messages. I simply watched. And once I stopped chasing after scraps of attention, patterns appeared everywhere. Every morning, I sat at the small breakfast table near the kitchen window with my coffee and tablet, scrolling quietly through years of family posts. It became almost unbearable once I started noticing what had always been there. In older photos, I stood beside Daniel during holidays, graduations, birthdays. Then slowly over time I shifted farther away. Sometimes literally. Claire always positioned herself in the center while I stood near the edges like an elderly neighbor who accidentally wandered into the frame. Eventually I disappeared entirely. At first I wondered whether I was imagining it. Then I found the photo albums. Real ones. Heavy leather-bound albums stored in the hallway cabinet beside the guest bathroom. I spent an entire rainy afternoon turning pages while thunder rolled softly outside. There it was again. Christmas 10 years ago. Daniel sitting beside me opening gifts. 5 years later, Claire sat between us. 3 years later, I was placed at the far corner of the couch holding someone's purse while the rest of the family gathered tightly together in front of the fireplace. Small things. Tiny adjustments. But together they told a story I could no longer ignore. Claire had not forced me out of the family loudly. She had simply trained everyone to stop looking for me. Around 4 o'clock that afternoon, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened the front door and found Walter Bennett standing there holding a white bakery box against his chest. Thomas's oldest friend still wore pressed wool coats even when the weather barely justified them. I figured someone should bring the birthday cake eventually, he said gently. I almost smiled. Almost. I invited him inside, and we sat in the kitchen while rain tapped softly against the windows. Walter noticed the untouched flower arrangement still sitting in the dining room from my birthday dinner. The roses had already begun browning around the edges. Neither of us mentioned it. He poured coffee carefully before finally asking, "How much have they told you about the house?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Walter looked uncomfortable immediately. He removed his glasses slowly and rubbed the bridge of his nose the way Thomas used to whenever conversations became difficult. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "Daniel contacted me about 4 months ago asking questions about property transfer timelines." The kitchen suddenly felt very still. "Property transfer?" Walter nodded cautiously. "Claire apparently believes maintaining this place alone will become too difficult for you soon. They were discussing options. Options? Such a clean word for people planning your future without your knowledge. I stared at the rain sliding down the windows while my chest tightened slowly. This house was not just property. Thomas built the back deck with his own hands the summer Daniel turned 13. The hallway still carried faint pencil marks measuring Sophie and Mason's height each birthday. Every room held pieces of my life folded quietly into the walls. Did Daniel say what kind of options? I asked finally. Walter hesitated before answering. Downsizing. Assisted living communities. Selling before winter while the market remained strong. I laughed softly then. Not because anything felt funny. Because suddenly every conversation from the past 2 years sounded different in my head. Claire insisting the stairs worried her. Daniel suggesting smaller homes closer to town. Sophie casually asking whether I ever got lonely living here by myself. None of it had been concern. They were preparing me. Softening me. Like people testing ice before stepping onto a frozen lake. Walter reached across the table and rested his hand gently over mine. Thomas anticipated some of this before he passed, he said quietly. Then he looked toward the hallway where the family portraits hung in silent rows along the wall. That is why he changed certain things before the end. Walter left just before sunset, but his words remained inside the house long after the sound of his car disappeared down the street. Thomas anticipated some of this before he passed. I kept hearing that sentence over and over while I washed our coffee cups at the sink. Outside, rain still drifted softly across the backyard, turning the maple leaves dark red against the wet grass. For years after Thomas died, I avoided touching his office upstairs unless absolutely necessary. The room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and old paper. His reading glasses remained folded neatly beside a legal pad filled with half-finished notes written during his chemotherapy treatments. Sometimes grief hides itself inside ordinary objects more effectively than photographs ever could. That evening, for the first time in nearly 6 months, I unlocked the office door and stepped inside. Dust floated through the golden light from the desk lamp. Everything looked exactly the same. Thomas had always been organized to the point of obsession. File folders labeled in careful black handwriting lined the bookshelf beside his desk. Insurance, taxes, property records, trust, documents. My eyes stopped on the last label immediately. Trust documents. I sat slowly in his leather chair and opened the folder. Inside rested several sealed envelopes along with paperwork dated only 3 months before Thomas passed away. His handwriting covered the front of one envelope. For Evelyn. Private. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The letter inside was short. That was always Thomas's way. He believed people trusted long speeches too easily. If you are reading this, he wrote, then certain conversations I feared probably already happened. I know you will try to excuse Daniel because that is what you have always done. But I need you to see things clearly now. Love should not require you to disappear in order to keep peace. I stopped reading for a moment and pressed the paper flat against the desk. Even after death, Thomas still understood me better than anyone else ever had. I continued slowly. Claire is ambitious in ways Daniel does not fully understand. He mistakes her control for confidence. If pressure is ever placed on you regarding this house, your finances, or your independence, speak with Walter immediately before agreeing to anything. My chest tightened. Every sentence felt less like suspicion and more like preparation. Beneath the letter sat updated trust paperwork bearing Thomas's signature. I stared at the pages carefully while rain tapped against the office windows. The house remained fully protected in my name through a family trust Thomas established shortly before his death. But there was another clause added later. One I had never seen before. Any attempt to pressure, manipulate, or coerce property transfer from the surviving spouse would trigger an immediate restructuring of inheritance distributions. I read the paragraph twice to make sure I understood correctly. If concerns about undue influence emerged, Daniel's direct inheritance rights could legally be suspended and redirected elsewhere at the trustee's discretion. Walter. Thomas had made Walter the trustee. My heart pounded slowly now, not from fear but realization. Thomas saw this coming. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not the cruise or the birthday dinner or Claire's cold smile and family photographs. But he saw enough. Suddenly dozens of conversations from Thomas's final months returned to me with new meaning. The way he insisted I learn where financial documents were stored. The way he discouraged Daniel from handling paperwork to make things easier. The long private conversations between Thomas and Walter behind closed office doors after chemotherapy appointments. At the time, I thought they were discussing estate taxes. Now I understood they were protecting me. I leaned back in the leather chair and looked around the office quietly. For years, I believed losing Thomas left me completely alone in this family. But sitting there surrounded by his careful preparation, I realized something unexpected. He had not left me defenseless. He had left me warned. And for the first time since my birthday dinner, I no longer felt like the lonely old woman waiting beside a cold table. I felt awake. 2 weeks later, Daniel and Claire finally returned from the cruise. I knew because Claire immediately began posting photographs again. Sunset dinners, souvenir shopping, matching linen outfits beside turquoise water. Every image looked polished enough for a travel magazine. Under one photo, Claire wrote, "Nothing matters more than family time." I stared at that sentence while sitting alone in my kitchen, eating tomato soup from a chipped bowl Thomas bought at a roadside antique shop 20 years earlier. Then I closed the app and finished my lunch in silence. 3 days after their return, Daniel called asking if they could come by Sunday evening for dinner. His voice sounded unusually careful, like someone testing the stability of ice beneath each step. "The kids miss you," he added quickly. Another polished sentence. I agreed anyway. Sunday arrived cold and windy. By 4 o'clock, the maple tree outside had shed almost all its leaves across the front lawn. I spent the afternoon preparing dinner with slow, deliberate movements. Roast chicken, green beans with almonds, sweet potatoes with brown sugar. The same kind of meal I had cooked for family Sundays since Daniel was young enough to need a booster seat at the table. But this time felt different. Not emotional, observational. Like I was preparing a stage before finally seeing the entire performance clearly. At exactly 5:32, Claire's white SUV pulled into the driveway. Always punctual when appearances mattered. I watched through the living room curtains as Daniel carried a pie box toward the front porch, while Claire adjusted Sophie's scarf before stepping out of the car herself. Even from a distance she looked composed, controlled, beautiful in the expensive, polished way magazine advertisements teach women to become. When I opened the front door, Claire smiled immediately and wrapped her arms around me. "Evelyn, we missed you so much." Her perfume smelled like vanilla and cedarwood. Warm, expensive, artificial. "Did you?" I asked softly. For half a second her smile stiffened. Then it returned perfectly polished again. Of course. Dinner unfolded exactly the way I expected. Daniel overcompensated with excessive friendliness. Sophie showed me photos from school. Mason talked excitedly about basketball tryouts. Claire complimented every dish while carefully steering conversation away from my birthday entirely. Watching her felt strangely fascinating now that I understood the mechanics underneath it all. Claire controlled rooms the way conductors controlled orchestras, redirecting tension before it fully formed, filling silence before difficult truths could enter it. Halfway through dinner, Daniel finally cleared his throat. "Mom," he began carefully, "Claire and I have been thinking a lot lately about making life easier for you." There it was. I placed my fork down gently beside my plate. Claire folded her hands together with practiced concern. "This house is beautiful," she said softly, glancing around the dining room. "But maintaining something this large alone at your age must feel exhausting sometimes." My age. The phrase landed differently now. Not concern. Strategy. Daniel leaned forward slightly. "There are some incredible retirement communities outside Naperville. Golf courses, walking trails, social events." Claire nodded sympathetically. "You would have people around you all the time instead of being isolated here." Isolated. Such an interesting word coming from the people who created the isolation themselves. I looked around the dining room slowly before answering. Candlelight reflected softly against the china cabinet Thomas built by hand 30 years earlier. Family photographs lined the walls. Memories filled every corner of the room. "I like my house," I said calmly. Claire smiled patiently, the way teachers smile at stubborn children. "Of course. But eventually practical decisions become necessary." Practical decisions. I noticed Walter's words echoing inside my head then. Pressure regarding this house. They were doing it carefully. Gently. But they were doing it. Sophie suddenly looked uncomfortable beside Claire. Mason focused intensely on his plate. Daniel avoided my eyes completely. For years I would have softened the moment. Changed the subject. Protected everyone from discomfort. But something inside me had gone still now. Very still. I folded my napkin carefully onto the table and looked directly at Claire for the first time all evening. Thomas made certain arrangements before he died, I said quietly. Arrangements neither of you seem to fully understand yet. The entire table went silent. The silence after my sentence felt heavier than the storm clouds gathering outside the dining room windows. Claire's smile faded first. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to finally see the irritation underneath it. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his chair while Sophie glanced between us with growing confusion. Mason kept staring at his plate like he wished he could disappear completely. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. What kind of arrangements? Daniel asked carefully. His voice sounded thinner now, less confident. I looked directly at him. The kind involving this house. The trust. My financial protections. Claire spoke before he could answer. Evelyn. Nobody is trying to pressure you. There it was again. That polished tone. Calm enough to sound reasonable. Soft enough to make anyone questioning her appear emotional instead. I almost admired how practiced she was. Really? I asked quietly. Then why did Walter tell me you contacted him months ago about transferring property ownership? Daniel's face changed instantly. Just for a second. But I saw it. Shock. Claire turned toward him sharply before recovering almost immediately. Walter misunderstood, she replied smoothly. We were only discussing future planning because we care about you. Care. Such a useful word for people trying to rearrange someone else's life. I leaned back slightly in my chair while thunder rolled faintly outside. You planned a family cruise during my birthday and left me alone in this house with 8 empty place settings, I said softly. Please do not insult me by pretending this conversation is about care. Sophie lowered her fork slowly. Wait, she whispered, looking at her parents. Grandma was alone on her birthday? Claire answered immediately. Sweetheart, your grandmother knew about the trip. No, I said calmly without raising my voice. I did not. The room went still again. Daniel rubbed his forehead with one hand. Mom, we already talked about this. Yes, I replied. And during that conversation you suggested I forgot. Claire exhaled sharply then. Tiny cracks were finally appearing beneath her composure. Evelyn, she said. With all respect, lately you have seemed more sensitive than usual. We have been trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. Sensitive. Conflict. The language of someone quietly rewriting another person into the problem. But this time something unexpected happened. Sophie looked directly at her mother and frowned. Mom, she said slowly, you told us Grandma preferred quiet birthdays. Claire blinked once. Well, she usually does. No, Sophie answered carefully. She always hosts dinners. Daniel stared down at the table now. Mason finally looked up too, confusion spreading across his face. Children notice more than adults realize. Especially older children standing at the edge of adulthood themselves. I stood slowly and carried empty dishes toward the kitchen sink. Nobody spoke while water ran softly over the plates. Finally Claire followed me into the kitchen. I could feel her presence behind me before she spoke. I think this is getting blown out of proportion, she said quietly. I dried my hands carefully with a dish towel before turning toward her. Close, she looked different tonight. Still beautiful. Still polished. But strained now. Like someone struggling to maintain control over a conversation slipping beyond her reach. You know, I said softly. For years I kept thinking maybe I was imagining things. The missed invitations. The changed plans. The way everyone slowly stopped including me. Claire crossed her arms defensively. Nobody excluded you. I nodded slowly. Then tell me something honestly. She said nothing. When exactly did I become embarrassing to you? For the first time since I met her, Claire had no immediate answer. Her face hardened slightly instead. Colder now. More honest. You make everything heavy sometimes, she admitted quietly. Daniel already carries enough stress. There it was. Finally. Not hidden beneath concern or politeness anymore. Just the truth standing plainly between us under the kitchen lights. I looked at her for several seconds before smiling gently. Not angry. Not wounded. Just certain. Thank you, I said softly. Claire frowned slightly. For what? I folded the dish towel neatly beside the sink. For finally saying it out loud. Then I walked back into the dining room where Daniel still sat staring silently at the table. And for the first time in years, I realized Claire was no longer controlling the story everyone believed about me. After that dinner, something shifted permanently inside the family. Not loudly. Families rarely break loudly after decades together. Most of the time they crack quietly, like ice spreading across a winter lake long before anyone notices the danger underneath their feet. Daniel stopped calling for almost 2 weeks. Claire did not contact me at all. But Sophie did. The first message arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, while I was trimming dead flowers from the front garden before the first frost arrived. Grandma, can I come see you this weekend? Just that. Simple. Careful. I stared at the text message longer than necessary before answering yes. Saturday morning arrived cold and bright. By 10 o'clock, Sophie sat across from me at the kitchen table wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt and holding a mug of hot chocolate with both hands. She looked nervous. Older somehow. Like adulthood had quietly stepped into the room ahead of schedule. I did not know about your birthday dinner, she said softly after several minutes of silence. I believed her immediately. Claire always controlled information carefully. I know, I answered. Sophie stared down into her mug. Mom said you wanted space lately. I almost smiled at that. Such elegant manipulation. Even isolation had been rewritten into my choice. Did I seem like someone who wanted space from her family? Sophie shook her head slowly. Sunlight spilled across the kitchen floor while the old clock above the refrigerator ticked steadily in the background. Finally she looked up at me again. Grandma, she whispered. Have you been lonely for a long time? The question settled deep inside my chest because children rarely ask questions unless they already know the answer. I looked around the kitchen slowly before responding. The curtains Thomas picked out during our kitchen remodel 15 years earlier still hung beside the windows. The wooden table still carried tiny scratches from when Daniel built school science projects there as a teenager. Every corner of the room held pieces of my life. But loneliness does not always come from empty rooms. Sometimes it comes from sitting in full rooms where nobody truly sees you anymore. Yes, I admitted quietly. Sophie's eyes filled slightly with tears she tried hard not to show. I am sorry. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand gently. None of this belongs to you. Later that afternoon, after Sophie left, I found an envelope tucked beneath the sugar jar on the counter. Inside was a handwritten note. Grandma, I do not think you are depressing. I think you are the only honest person in this family. I read the sentence 3 times before carefully folding the paper back into the envelope. That night, Daniel finally called. His voice sounded exhausted. Older. Mom, he said quietly. I think maybe I missed things I should have seen. Outside, snow had just started falling lightly across the backyard. The first snow of the season. Maybe, I answered calmly. Silence stretched between us for several seconds. Then he spoke again. Claire and I are having some problems. I closed my eyes briefly. Not because I felt victorious. I did not. There is nothing satisfying about watching your child realize too late that he helped build the loneliness he now cannot understand. Daniel, I said softly, marriages are complicated. Did Dad really change the trust because of us? He asked finally. I looked toward the hallway where Thomas's photograph still rested beside the staircase. Even now I could almost hear his steady voice inside my memory. Love should not require you to disappear in order to keep peace. Your father changed the trust because he loved me, I answered quietly. Another long silence followed. Then Daniel whispered something so softly I almost missed it. I think I forgot how to. After the call ended, I carried my tea into the living room and sat beside the window watching snow cover the neighborhood in slow white silence. The house no longer felt hollow. It felt calm. Steady. Mine. At 70 years old, I finally understood something that took me an entire lifetime to learn. Sometimes losing the version of family that keeps diminishing you is not a tragedy. Sometimes it is the first honest beginning you have had in years.